Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm coming to you today to discuss the notion of information and how that inflects within our contemporary conversation. The word information is a bit slippery, in part because it's often used in a broad way as almost synonymous with knowledge. However, it comes to beginning, say, the late 19th century, but in particular from the mid 20th century forward, assume a more technical significance, to which we will turn momentarily. Indeed, etymologically, it reaches further back than that, with a basis essentially in Latin. Information is that which informs, that which gives form or concrete shape, determination, aspect to a particular entity, a thing, if you like, to draw on a sort of more colloquial term. Now, what begins to animate its more specifically contemporary usage is development within theoretical physics, and particularly within the domain of thermodynamics, where it was encountered the notion that if you take a system, say a system of gases, for example, or a gas, and you fix certain, let's say, macroscopic features, such as its temperature, its volume, pressure, and so forth, given those higher level constraints, there are innumerable manners in which they can be realized from differing microscopic states of that system. It's more or less a case of what is termed in other corridors multiple realizability. That's a concept which comes up, for example, in philosophy of mind, though with reference to a very different set of questions or issues. In any event, given that you can take these higher level properties and fix them, and then from that bounded set of conditions still realize that there are more than one way to arrive at them, you can actually calculate the differing sort of trajectories which approach that end. And the freedom or the space or the indeterminacy underlying those different processes can be measured. And the measure which came to ascent is entropy, which often is termed the measure of disorder in the system. And a striking conclusion was realized in connection with this research under the second law of thermodynamics, is how it's usually termed. The striking conclusion was that in any given system, its entropy never decreases. It can only decrease with time. That means that the ambient disorder of the system approaches a condition of actually homogeneity, which then precludes, interestingly enough, our ability to really specify its more ultimate trajectory, except in a way that is almost empty of significance. It becomes incredibly generic. And if you take this and translate that epistemological condition, and consider its ontological consequences, to use those rather technical phrasings, you arrive at the insinuation that the universe itself is tending toward a state of perfect disorder. There's a kind of paradox there, because perfect disorder almost looks isomorphic with perfect order, because in either case you have a homogeneous condition of beings and being. I don't want to get too far off track there. It's obviously an avenue that can lead very far philosophically. And it is germane to the ultimate destination here, which is information. What is information? It is posited by, I believe, a chap by the name of Boltzmann in and along with this constellation of approaches, that you can actually conceive of entropy as related to what we term information, as that an entropic system is one which actually has an abundance of information in it, because it requires an abundance of information to fix all its particular features or facets. It's counterintuitive. You would think that disorder and information are at odds with each other, but in fact they correlate positively. And that is in virtue of the circumstance that when a system exhibits a kind of order, that lends it a predictability. In turn, that predictability actually lessens our need to arrive at more information to understand what's going on within the system. In 1948, Claude Shannon, and his work is built on the shoulders of a few other cats, wrote a truly seminal paper entitled Mathematical Theory of Communication. A few years later, in conjunction with a guy by the name of oh goodness, I want to say it's Walter Weaver. Hope that's not quite wrong. Hopefully that's right. I'll put the link below and correct accordingly if it isn't. But they wrote a subsequent little book called The Mathematical Theory of Communication, which prefaces Shannon's paper with very nice, sort of more popularizing approach to sort of explicate what's going on within the paper in less arid terms, because the paper itself is very mathematically dense. The math isn't necessarily all that difficult, but it's sufficient in its sophistication that you need a certain level of training to be able to access it. Apart from those mathematical flourishes, though, there's a great deal of substance which doesn't rely on that conversancy, and that's where the mathematical theory of communication, that text, is helpful. But in any event, what goes on there in that paper is that Claude Shannon picks up on these motifs that have been sort of percolating within the arenas of theoretical physics and applies them to theories of communication. And he opens the paper with the proposition that the fundamental challenge of communication is to take a message and relay it to a secondary site where it can be reconstructed. And in that reconstruction, let me step back. Give the person who receives it either a replication or an approximate replication of the original message. So there's a little diagram he says, so you've got the message, and then you have a space of what he calls encoding, which takes the message and puts it in a particular format that is amenable to transmission over a channel to a receiving device or space, which then decodes that message, and in the process of decoding recreates its original form, which is then inherited by the person who is receiving it. Within this very generic framework, he actually is able to unify all these disparate engineering problems that have been considered more or less technically independent. And he's able to do that vis-a-vis an approach to message which ties in to the concept of information, which had been derived from the development of the concept of entropy earlier. And what goes on is you actually begin to treat language itself as a system, in particular of signs. And these signs in turn have a kind of a logic within them that can be exploited to subject the sign system in question to probabilistic constraints. What do I mean by that? Well, we can take the English language for example. You've got in written terms, 26 letters. You can add a few more letters if you like for spaces, punctuation, all that, just to round it off to 32, which you will note is 2 to the 5th power. The reason that's important is because given 32 possibilities, what you're requiring are 5 what he calls bits of information. How does that work? Well, information is now effectively defined as a kind of differential which enables discernment of underlying structure. So the differential is being here put in barely binary terms. 1, 0, yes, no, on, off, what have you. So you're trying to relay a letter to someone in the English language. So you actually begin by not asking, what is it? A, is it B, is it C, is it D, or whatever? No. Instead you say something like, is it A or not A? And then that eliminates a certain portion, and then, go on and so forth. And if you ask 2 to the 5th questions, then that gives you 2 to the 5th possibilities, 32 possibilities, right? I'm putting it just a little inexactly, because what I'm leaving out of that conveyance is that the question can't just eliminate one letter. It actually has to eliminate a number of them. So this is where the probability comes into the mix. You can begin by asking for the most common letter used, which I think is E. You say, is it E, is it not E? Because there's a higher probability of E that can sort of bring you closer to the fold. And you use that in conjunction with probability. It turns out that within 5 steps, you can arrive at the letter in question. Okay? So, I'll have to do a follow-up video to clarify that point, because I feel it's a bit inexact. But if you will sort of bear with that crude relayance for the moment, what becomes apparent is that through this approach you arrive at an incredibly versatile and powerful tool to subject language to a reformatting that then can be coded literally in a digital fashion, digital with reference to the binary framework we noted before. And through that subjection to digital framing, you can do all sorts of things. And it's not just in terms of language, it's also in terms of anything that can be related to symbolic transmission. The elegance of Shannon's approach immediately gave rise to great excitement and the birth of a field which is called information theory. A moniker which Shannon and others actually lamented, because it gave one the impression that it was about information, when in fact the real object of Shannon's paper and what these people who were researching and working with Shannon or pursuing was effective ways to create and to communicate. And there's a very interesting backdrop historically, and it relates to things like cryptography, etc., etc. And I'm not going to go into all that right now. But that conflation of concern with information as opposed to the relay of information becomes subsequently important in our contemporary conversation. The conflation allows for all sorts of very problematic reductions in our approaches to innumerable topics. Believing that if we can simply corral the questions that face us, whether in political or social or scientific arenas, into a digital format, we can conjoin that with an application of statistical mathematics to arrive at a certainty and control of the universe which had hitherto been undreamt of. And here's the problem with that. The problem with that reductive tendency is that it completely excludes or occludes the integral act of interpretation. That is what actually gives this concept that we term information its power. And even more primitively than information understood as a digitally reduced framework. It's simply a differentiation within an object, a field that we apprehend, which gives that object or field a capacity to receive meaning. And virtually anything that can be conceived of as a sign is potentially a bearer of information. But of course, without an interpreter, and without an interpreter working with certain constraints interpretively, it's all for naught. It's all empty. And the emptiness is both the strength and the weakness of information. In that of itself, it is useless. But also the emptiness allows it as a concept to exhibit an extraordinary versatility. Once we, but it's a versatility that we must use advisedly, lest we fall into the error of leaving out this interpretive moment. Which might seem like I'm splitting a hair, but I'm not. What I'm talking about is whether we want to continue to include human beings or just sentient entities as operating in an integral way within the universe. And my position is that the very lax manner in which we have allowed the concept of information to pervade and even to titillate us in the public discourse has contributed to positively an exclusion of the subject as playing a real and integral role in understanding and in shaping the world. And this exclusion has powerful social and political, ethical repercussions that deserve weighty consideration. In fact, Claude Shannon himself was aware of these controversies, and my understanding is concerned about the fact that the apparatuses that he had developed could in fact sort of fall into irresponsible hands. Not necessarily in the sinister way which might be connoted by how I framed that particular sentence, but certainly in a sufficient way that I just want to explicitly kind of dispel the impression that any kind of guilt should be laid at his doorstep, because he made quite clear statements that this controversy, which could be sort of also put in terms of whether the formal can be reduced, or the semantic can be reduced to the formal. He made quite explicit statements that the semantic is not reducible to the formal, or at least not in any way in which is germane to the project that took him up. So, I've gone on a certain length about information and how it's important, to recapitulate what I want to focus on and what I want to stress is that the information which surrounds us and which has come to play such a crucial role in our age only has its power in virtue of that we, as sentient, as conscious entities, are participating in this world. And there is a responsibility which accompanies that participation that we would do well to embrace more advisedly. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at that. I thank you guys for listening at such length. I didn't know I was going to go on quite over such a stretch, but there you have it. I'll tell you what, if you thought it was worthwhile, please go ahead and like, share, subscribe, comment, all that jazz. And I'll be coming to you again sooner rather than later. So this is Tom Lynn signing off. Talk to you guys on the other side. Ciao.